Everyone knows the story of the two young, bullish, and precocious Steves, Jobs and Wozniak. From the 1976 co-founding of Apple in Jobs' childhood home to his departure from Apple in 1985 after being forced out by CEO John Sculley and the board of directors, it's an infamous tale that has been played out multiple times in various Hollywood films. Everyone also knows of Steve's return to Apple in 1996 and the products that followed: the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, iPad, and more. For well over a decade now, Apple has absolutely dominated the tech industry as one of the most valuable companies on the planet. And love them or hate them, you can't deny the impact that Apple has had on modern society. What a lot of people don't know, however, is what happened with Apple during those years without Jobs. Today, we're going to talk about this: an ugly, yellowed plastic computer case that looks like a run-of-the-mill IBM PC-AT compatible computer, a machine manufactured by one of the hundreds of computer companies that existed during the 1980s home computer boom. But this power computing Power Center 132 is not your run-of-the-mill IBM PC-AT. Oh no, this computer runs Apple's Macintosh System 7 operating system, and it is not a Mac. But it's not a Hackintosh either. Let's rewind a little bit. The Apple II series of computers absolutely dominated the 8-bit computer market. It's really hard to overstate how important and revolutionary the Apple II was. It was the first PC capable of displaying color, the first with easy end-user expansion, and the first to run spreadsheet software for personal computers, and it took the world by storm. To put its importance into perspective, PC World magazine dubbed the Apple II the greatest PC of all time, and it really put Apple on the map. 7 years later, the Macintosh, with its graphical user interface and weird little pointer device called a mouse, was supposed to be the next big leap forward in home computing. However, it launched to, lukewarm sales. Why? Well, it lacked a solid software catalog to appeal to businesses, and home consumers just couldn't reconcile with the hefty $2,500 price tag. The Mac was struggling, and Apple received a bit of advice in a letter from none other than Bill Gates. Now, you gotta understand the relationship that Gates and Jobs had at this point in time. You see, the two, while not friends, had a lot of respect for one another, and they really weren't competitors.
Well, to create a new standard, it takes something that's not just a little bit different. It takes something that's really new and really captures people's imagination. And the Macintosh, of all the machines I've ever seen, is the only one that meets that standard.
Apple had licensed BASIC, the general-purpose high-level programming language, from Microsoft for the Apple II in the late 1970s. And until the IBM PC had become popular in the early 80s, a lot of Microsoft's revenue came directly from Apple. So during the early development phase of the Macintosh, Jobs flew Gates down to Cupertino to check out the Mac. And Microsoft began to invest a considerable amount of money into developing software for the Macintosh platform, becoming Apple's most important software partner. Jobs even paraded Gates at a conference hosted by Apple for Macintosh reseller partners in 1983. Take a look.
My name is Bill Gates. I'm chairman of Microsoft. And during 1984, Microsoft expects to get half of its revenues from Macintosh software.
Microsoft was invested in the Macintosh, and so the poor sales numbers weren't just hurting Apple. In the 1985 letter to Apple executives, Gates suggested that the only way the Macintosh could survive or become a market leader was if Apple licensed out the operating system to third-party hardware makers to increase market penetration. Now, Apple, believing itself to be a hardware company more than a software company, ignored Gates's guidance. And less than a year later, Microsoft took the suggestion Apple ignored and introduced Windows 1.0. The friendly relationship between Microsoft and Apple dissolved entirely. One thing led to another, and Apple sued Microsoft for breach of contract and for copyright violation in taking what Apple believed to be its novel graphical user interface design. That whole story is a bit controversial in and of itself, but Apple eventually lost the suit. But during the nearly 6 years of litigation, Microsoft had continued to rapidly develop Windows, and Apple's hardware lineup became increasingly convoluted, with the Macintosh operating system performing and aging poorly. In an attempt to increase their dwindling market share in an area quickly becoming dominated by Windows, Apple CEO Michael Spindler decided to do what Gates had suggested nearly a decade prior. They began licensing Macintosh System 7. So up to 6 companies would be allowed to license Apple's operating system, and Apple would not limit them in terms of hardware or distribution strategy. Believe it or not, there weren't that many companies chomping at the bit to license an aging operating system that was getting eviscerated by Windows in terms of market share. It took a full year until the first hardware partner signed the licensing agreement. A little startup comprised of many ex-Apple engineers named Power Computing. The CEO and owner, Steve Kong, was quirky, but had been a successful executive at Daewoo's PC division and wanted back into the computer market. Power Computing took just 5 months from their licensure of System 7 to the first clone being released on the market. And it was revered by Mac users as modular, standardized, fast, and less expensive than Apple's competing machines. I'm actually wearing a Power Computing shirt that was given out at Macworld 1995 that adorns their edgy political military marketing with their slogan, "Fight back for the Mac." The machine I have here is a PowerCenter 132, released on my 3rd birthday in April of 1996, which rocks, as the name implies, a 132 MHz PowerPC 604 processor. Now, the system shipped with 8 megs of RAM by default. Yes, megs of RAM by default. But because this computer was built in something very close to an IBM-compatible PC case, everything is very highly modular. And whomever owned this computer originally upgraded the system to 82 megs of RAM, although it was expandable to a colossal 512 megabytes of memory. It has a massive 1 gigabyte hard drive disk, and what seems by today's standards a little bit crazy, the CPU is not soldered or socketed to the mainboard. Rather, it's a standalone slotted card, which made system upgrades a piece of cake. This machine launched at $2,500, and it made it to market nearly 6 months before Apple's similarly spec'd competitor. However, it's possible that Apple's Power Macintosh 7600 was a direct response to the Power Computing 132, because it released with even more expandability and user upgradability than the Power PC machine at just $200 more. But at the end of the day, this is just it's a bog standard Mac. It might not look like one, and it might not bear Apple's logos, but at least on the outside, functionally, other than running a special version of System 7.5.3 L, which included drivers and compatibility for their Apple hard drives and peripherals, it was a Mac. It was just a cheaper Mac. Power Computing had a few really cool firsts. They weren't just the first Macintosh clone maker, but they were the first company to sell $1 million worth of products via the internet. Suck it, Bezos. After doing $250 million in revenue in their first year of operation, it was very clear that Power Computing was not expanding Apple's market share, but merely cutting into its own sales, and Apple suffered from it. Upon Jobs' return to Apple in 1996, he canceled the Mac clone program and expired everyone's license by releasing System 8 earlier than expected, which none of the clone makers had licensed to use, except for Power Computing. To get them off the market, Apple was resigned to purchasing Power Computing and their key assets for $10 million in cash and more than $100 million in stock options. The Macintosh clone era is a tiny blip in Apple's history that's easy to forget, but it's kind of wild to think that at one point, Apple allowed what were essentially Hackintoshes to be sold on the market. Did you ever own a Macintosh clone, or did you know about them? Let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, well, that other button seems to work okay too. Get subscribed for more awesome tech videos like this one, but most importantly, and as always, stay snazzy. Thanks for watching. So I'm editing the video you just watched right now, and a friend, Stephen Hackett, sent me a video that was made internal to Apple in 1994 about Macintosh clones. Check it out.
I think we're a clone now, 'cause every bit of code is a hand-me-down. I think we're a clone now. The Power Macintosh has the benchmark crown. I think we're a clone now. Pentium